Hello, welcome to episode 3 of Screenwriting Studies, the podcast. I can see on my screen some aficionados who are already becoming regulars at these live sessions. But for those of you who might be new, and for those who might be watching the recording for the first time at a later time, let me just say that this podcast series originates from the Palgrave Handbook of Screenwriting Studies, which was co-edited by Rosamund Davis, Klaus Tieber, and myself. And the handbook project brought together the expertise of dozens of scholars from around the world. And so after it was published, we thought instead of archiving it as a done thing, why not use it to broaden the interest around it? And that's why we came up with the idea of this monthly appointment, which gives our fellow scholars from all over the world a chance to interact with the authors. In each episode, we draw inspiration from the chapter that our authors have contributed to the handbook, and then we let the conversation take us wherever it leads us, although always with a focus on all things screenwriting. And we started with Christine Thompson in episode 1 back in January. Then we had Stephen Price in episode 2, and the recording of both these episodes are available to anyone who would like to catch up. And today it is my honor and pleasure to introduce our guest of episode 3. She is an expert in labor and employment law, and she has published on a wide range of related subjects. But of course, we have a vested interest in her work about writers in the entertainment industry. Let me cite 2 major volumes before I introduce her properly. The first one is Working Knowledge, Employee Innovation, and the Rise of Corporate Intellectual Property from the 1800 to 1930. And this was released by UNC in 2009. And I will then maybe put the titles in the chat box in a minute. And then Writing for Hire, Unions, Hollywood, and Madison Avenue, published by Harvard University Press in 2016. Now, anecdotally, this was around the time, 2016, when this book was published, Writing for Hire. This was around the time when we first started to think about the handbook project. And we knew we had to have this author on board to contribute a chapter on this topic, which eventually became chapter 28 of our handbook, titled The Different American Legal Structures for Unionization of Writers for Stage and Screen. She is the Barbara Nachtrip Armstrong Professor of Law at the University of California, Berkeley. So please join me in welcoming our guest, Catherine Fisk. Catherine, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you. I'm honored to be here, truly honored.
First of all, I thought it would be quite useful maybe to begin by looking at what in essence is the premise of your chapter in the handbook. And that is the different legal status of the 2 guilds, the Writers Guild and the Dramatists Guild, and how this difference impacts their collective bargaining actions.
Writers for the screen, film, and television are employees for purposes of U.S. federal labor law, which refers to the law of unions and management and collective negotiation, which means that they are empowered by law to negotiate collectively over conditions of employment. And they have been doing so since the 1930s, including through dramatic changes in the industry, the decline of the classic Hollywood studio system, the rise of television, the rise of streaming, all of that. The system has been remarkably flexible as there have been major industrial changes, major changes in working conditions for writers, and it has spread as different entities with different models have come into the industry. And it's also allowed writers to respond collectively to structural problems, such as the dramatic transformation in the role that agents played or play over the last few decades, no longer being just the representative of the writer and negotiating with a studio or production company, but rather being producers in their own right with tremendous market power. In contrast, and the reason why this book, although it's focused on screenwriting, also addresses writing for the stage, is that the legal status of playwrights is much more tenuous. And as a consequence, playwrights are much more vulnerable to economic and structural shocks in the industry, and to the concerted market power, especially now in commercial theater, which I refer to in the chapter as Broadway, but it's not, of course, only on Broadway or even in New York City. And now that commercial theater is increasingly dominated by the same companies that control Hollywood, as we see major commercial productions like Wicked go from the stage to the screen, and also successful movies going from the screen to the stage. And I'm grateful to my co-author, who on a different project, Brent Salter, who knows far more about theater than I do, for really educating me about the history and the conditions of writing for the theater. But as a labor professor, and for those of you who are watching this Zoom or listening to the podcast who are interested in the role that labor plays in protecting writers, the comparison to American writers for the stage is instructive. Dramatists, playwrights are not employees for purposes of labor law, which means they cannot safely bargain collectively. It's not because they're not protected by labor law, really. Writers in Hollywood rarely have to invoke labor law. They use their economic power, but rather by not being employees for purposes of labor law, it means that under American law, they cannot legally bargain collectively, because to do so would violate American antitrust law, which you in other parts of the world would know as competition law. That is, collective action by non-employee independent contractors is a competition or antitrust violation because it is an agreement in restraint of trade. And so this means that the collective agreements that dramatists have tried to negotiate, and there still is one, it's been sort of in existence since 1985, operates mainly as a model for individual playwright producer negotiations. It's just a guide. They can depart from it, although it could have consequences for either side in the industry. But more generally, when writers gain economic power, their agreement is at risk of antitrust liability through litigation that would strategically be brought by the producers, which, as I point out, and again, drawing on the really seminal work of Brent Salter, producers have used off and on over the last century for strategic purposes, for purposes of weakening the market position of the Dramatists Guild and its members, and then after litigation is filed and it sort of flails around and each party imposes some litigation costs on the other, the parties then come back to the table and negotiate. But the instability of the position of dramatists, we certainly saw during the pandemic when theater production shut down. So did, of course, film and television production. Writers were, of course, economically vulnerable because they were off work, but dramatists were asked to return money to theaters that had canceled productions. And so not only did they lose work, but then they faced some personal liability. And this is kind of a crazy regime in which the party should operate.
I was thinking we have another chapter in the handbook about the unionization of screenwriters in India. which is, of course, in the 1960s and 70s and onwards. And of course, it's a completely different context, but actually there are so many similarities, even though the social cultural context is so different. Now, because we talk on legal basis and legal principles and practices, we often take these notions for granted, but in fact, they are almost always the outcome of a range of contextual circumstances for which you give in your chapter, you give an incredibly detailed historical perspective and which really shed a light on how these came to be and why and what for. Now, in the core part of your chapter, since we mentioned it, among other things, you unpack these law provisions for writers and authors and both as independent contractors, but actually, and also the role of the mediating institutions for them. And of course, we invite everyone to read the chapter in full. But then you bookend the chapter by hinting at some future developments in light of what, at the time of writing the chapter, which was during the pandemic a few years ago, were two recent disputes. And one was about whether union membership should or should not be a prerequisite for copyright purposes. And the other one was how antitrust laws are being invoked as a means to try and limit collective action. Maybe if you pick one of these and you can tell us a little bit about because this was when you were writing the chapter. So has there been an aftermath to one of these and that you can tell us about?
Thank you. Let me talk about the copyright issue because it underlies why dramatists still insist on their status as independent contractors. Under US copyright law, an employee who writes a copyrighted work within the scope of his or her employment um, is writing a work made for hire, and under US copyright law, their employer is deemed the author and therefore the owner of the work. This has long been thought to be crucial in Hollywood or in writing for the screen because so many separately copyrightable contributions go into any piece of screen entertainment. The script, revisions of the script, as well as the musical compositions, and of course, the film or the television program itself is a copyrightable work. And so the movie studios early on decided that their business model depended on their owning the copyright to the script as well as the finished film. In Broadway or on Broadway, in stage entertainment, writers own the copyright in their work because they are not employees. And therefore, unless the work is commissioned, the writer is the author and the owner of the work. They feel very strongly about this, especially successful playwrights. Both because they think that they benefit economically from the ability to license the play over and over again, but also because being the owner of the work, they can prevent any modification of the work. And so they don't get rewritten unless they choose to collaborate with a dramaturg, which of course is common in writing for the stage, but they aren't compelled to be rewritten. They get to choose and they retain ultimate control. This is why dramatists have not fought harder for employee status. Reasonable minds could differ as to how many dramatists actually have the artistic autonomy that copyright ownership gives them, and whether the economic vulnerability that they experience by virtue of being independent contractors is compensated for by autonomy, and I'll leave that to others to talk about. But what I explored in the chapter was a case that was decided by the influential Federal Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit, which encompasses New York City, and it's one of the two most important federal courts of appeals in the United States for copyright law. The other is the Ninth Circuit, which covers Hollywood, California, and the West. Where the Second Circuit said what I have always thought, which is that a writer could be an employee for labor purposes because of the control that the producer exerts over their work or working conditions. And of course, stage producers do exert a fair amount of control, um, but be an independent contractor for purposes of copyright law, which would consider a different set of factors besides just working conditions and control over the conditions of work, such as, when rehearsals happen or things like that. And so this came about in the context of a dispute over the movie Friday the 13th, a horror film, where the screenwriter maintained that when he wrote the script for Friday the 13th in 1979, he wrote it on spec as an independent contractor. He just wrote it and sold it, and then it was filmed. And he wanted to assert the right under copyright law to reclaim the rights under the termination of transfer of copyright that's available to a writer after a certain number of years. And that right only exists. It's complicated, not worth going into. But the Second Circuit ruled that he was an independent contractor for purposes of copyright, even though he was a member of the Writers Guild. The owner of the copyright, the producer, argued that no, you have to choose. Either you can be a member of the Writers Guild and bargain collectively, in which case you must be an employee, or you can be an independent contractor for purposes of copyright law, and but you can't bargain collectively. And the Second Circuit said, no, they're two different statutes with two different policy goals, and they could have two different tests. I haven't seen, to answer your question about the follow-on consequences, many cases, or indeed any cases that are publicly known, where other writers in the pre-1980 period, where now they would have the right to terminate the transfer of copyright, litigate whether they were independent contractors for script purposes, for copyright purposes. My former colleague, Tony Reese, is the expert on termination of transfers and has a database. He's collecting these cases, and it may be that we will see more efforts to terminate the transfer of copyright for scripts written long ago that now the writer thinks has economic value and they would like to relicense, and they can't negotiate a deal with the studio, the production company that owns it, and so we'll get a fight over this. And we don't yet know whether other courts will follow the Second Circuit, especially the influential Ninth Circuit, on this issue, that will then break apart independent contractor for purposes of copyright from employee or independent contractor for purposes of labor law. I suspect that all parties in Hollywood are very eager not to blow up the system that's worked well for them for these 100 years. They don't want to bring in antitrust law because let's face it, parties on both sides work collectively because it works for their industry. And they don't want to destabilize the production company's ownership of all the copyrights to their work. But we'll see if one aggressive an influential participant in the market, Amazon, Netflix, who knows, decided that they could do without the Writers Guild and also without SAG-AFTRA and the Directors Guild. It would take all three of the talent guilds sticking together if they wanted to blow up the system and try to go to non-union, non-collective bargaining framework. And of course, they would have to outsource production because IATSE, the union that represents the craft and technical employees in US production, would have something to say about this. Um, you know, they could try. We'll see.
Let me pick on the copyright issue again, but to push the conversation maybe beyond the chapter itself. And I was thinking, you wrote the chapters. We said it earlier, only a few years ago. It was during the pandemic, but since then, it's fair to say that a few momentous and potentially seismic events have taken place. And so let's start with this one, the strike in 2023. It has led to the new MBA, the minimum basic agreement. But correct me if I'm wrong, that comes with a ticking clock attached because it's until 2026, and then it has to be sort of renegotiated or rediscussed. And meanwhile, the concerns around the use of artificial intelligence are through the roof. The Writers Guild in the United States has led the debate in this. Over here in the UK, and probably you can tell from my tone of voice as a member of the Writers Guild here, I'm not very happy about how my guild has been so timid until it has suddenly, a couple of months ago, woken up to the reality that the current government not only will not be taking their tepid recommendations on board, but is proposing to let the companies bypass existing laws on copyright and train their AI models as they see fit. And the EU is the first institution, probably the only one so far, to have approved the regulatory framework, the AI Act, but intellectual property and the creative industries are hardly even mentioned in it. So I realize it's impossible to tease out something so complex and meaningful in just a few minutes, but what is your take in this scenario?
The strike in 2023 was the first time since 1960 that the actors and the writers struck together. It was a long strike, extremely hard fought. Um, and the sense is that the writers won much of what they were asking for. And so I think if that is the widely accepted perspective, and if the writers can maintain solidarity with other workers in Hollywood, that will prompt their adversaries, if they are adversaries, to think hard about whether to provoke another strike. Now, with respect to AI in particular, one of the challenging issues for all participants, writers and the production companies, is how to define which uses of AI are a threat to the livelihood of writers and others. Writers might want to use AI in limited circumstances as they are working through a particular problem in drafting a script. Like banning anybody from using AI for any purpose doesn't seem to be in anybody's interest or indeed anybody's goal. On the other hand, writers want to be sure that AI doesn't supplant entirely, especially the junior writers who are just getting into the industry. AI is not yet ready to produce an entire series, especially a brand new, innovative series. I usually use the example of one of my favorite television series, Deadwood, right? I don't think AI is prepared to come up with the idea of a totally revolutionary, different kind of Western. It was a Western, some of which was written in iambic pentameter. Much of it was written in iambic pentameter. And if you've seen the show and have a particular favorite scene in it, you might think, gee, AI is not going to come up with one of my favorite ones where there is about 3 minutes of dialogue, all using one word, which you can't use on broadcast television. It's one of the 7 dirty words that cannot be said on network television. And I won't say it in your podcast. You'll just have to watch
We're
the
not
episode.
network television.
Pardon me?
We're not network television.
Yes, it's true. Well, I try not to swear unless I'm really provoked. But
I'm
let's just
joking.
say the word begins with C. It ends with R. It is a very nasty word. And there's a great scene where Al Swearingen, the sort of bar owner, unofficial mayor of the town, is negotiating or discussing with the Chinese man who runs the slaughterhouse about the threat that the mining company poses to their town, and they're trying to figure out whether bad people are coming to the town. And so there's a whole episode of dialogue or scene of dialogue where they're all describing these mining people as bad people and are they coming to town. Anyway, it's hilarious. AI can't do it. It wouldn't think of the idea. And so I think for truly innovative work, AI is not the threat. But could AI generate a plausible script for, the umpteenth episode of the, 15th season of some generic cop, police procedural? Probably. And the problem is that that's where writers make a living and also where they get trained. When I was doing a writer-based interview project with my former colleague Michael Zalay, and we were going around interviewing writers about the creative process and the role of the Writers Guild in it. A writer talked to me about how, or talked to us rather, about how young writers learn the craft of writing a script on budget by doing it. Junior writers have to learn that, and they learn it by writing as the junior person on an entry level position on maybe a fairly generic show before they develop the skills and the experience to manage a whole show as the showrunner. And, not every television show that makes money is path-breaking and innovative. Hence, everybody recognizes that a robust market for labor and for talent depends on training people and not substituting AI for them. And so I think the dilemma that all parties here are going to be struggling with is how to use AI in a way that doesn't destroy the training and the genuine creativity that writers bring that the bot can't replicate. And that I think is what the parties are thinking about, negotiating about, and then how to include that in a collective bargaining agreement with enforceable terms. Since, of course, a big part of what the Writers Guild and its MBA is about is not the sort of huge, creative, big budget,
Yeah.
buzzy shows, whatever they might be, but is rather for the sort of economically viable, but much more marginal shows that most people never hear of, or the movies that never are going to be released in a theater, where you have production companies that are more financially marginal, but also do things. And this is sort of the bread and butter of arbitration under the Writers Guild agreement is some producer just refuses to pay a writer or pays no residuals after the period where residuals are required. And that's what the writer does is protect the economically vulnerable. Sorry, that is what the Writers Guild
Yeah.
does, protecting the economically vulnerable writer from the economically marginal producer. Um, and that's a really important role that you need a union for.
Yeah. Should we open it up to the floor for questions? Because I can go on for the whole day, as many people on this in this screen know. But yes, questions, please.
Thank you. Sorry if I miss some part. Maybe you already talked about this, but my question goes about the relationships or connections between the two types of associations. I mean, in your research, did you perhaps find some connections? Have they established connections in order to defend their rights, or are they associations without any connection at all? And if that did those connections work effectively?
So the guilds that represent writers, directors, actors in Hollywood, the guild that represents playwrights, have deep connections with each other and with the other unions or guilds or associations that represent all the talent as well as the craft and technical workers whose work is crucial, because they recognize that although, writers and actors, especially actors as well as directors, get an outsized share of the credit for the creativity in film and television, they are certainly not the only people whose contributions are crucial, however much the tabloids or Chatter or the Academy Awards wants to focus on some people rather than others. And so that kind of connection with understanding what the issues are, understanding how interdependent they are, exists across the whole industry. And of course, many people, especially people who are not kind of successful, regularly working writers in Hollywood, do all kinds of other writing because they have to be incredibly entrepreneurial to be able to pay their rent every month. And so they have connections in other industries and are talking across the boundaries of their membership. And I know less about the connections internationally. I suspect some people who are on this Zoom or who will listen to this podcast know more about it than I do. Anecdotally, I know that there are lots of connections because so much of especially film and television production happens outside the boundaries of the United States. And of course, there is such a huge US market for the fantastic film and TV that is being produced all over the world. I watch these shows myself. And so I think there are connections on the business side, certainly, but as among the production companies and the streaming services, et cetera. But then I think there are corresponding connections on the creative side and the technical side.
I just wondered if you had any thoughts or whether it's sort of historically or contemporarily in terms of how, because presumably there would have been a lot of dramatists kind of moving to Hollywood historically and a lot and what their kind of views are in terms of these different bargaining patterns that and whether they saw how they viewed and whether they saw it in their to their gain to thus join the WGA. Can they be members of both, and can they use that to their advantage?
Thank you. That's a great question. Historically, many dramatists did write for the screen, in part because in the 1940s, 30s, 20s, 30s, 40s, there was so much money sloshing around Hollywood that you could make a lot of money. That's the sort of famous story, and I'm sure that many of the contributors to this volume know more than I do. And still, there is no reason why you couldn't be a member of both guilds, one for when you're writing for the stage, one for when you're writing for the screen. And the US is to some extent anomalous, or at least not the only way the industry is structured. Professor Salter, Dr. Salter, is Australian originally and worked in Australian theater. And there may be listeners who are from Australia or who know about it, where there is a fair amount of mobility back and forth between screen and the screen industry and stage, and also a generally more economically supportive ecosystem for theater than in the US, which makes writing for the stage, or indeed any aspect of theater production, less economically precarious than in the US. Historically, writing for the screen in the US has been more economically stable. That's changing now, but a television writing job used to be about 40 weeks a year of reasonably well-paid work. Every TV show was 22 episodes. I remember the days from my childhood where shows always debuted in September, and then they wrapped up in about April or May, and then reruns all summer. And that led to a very organized labor market for TV writing that didn't really exist for stage or screen, although there still is a season for theater, especially in some places. But given the economic vulnerability of writing outside of film and television, especially historically television, a lot of the movement was to TV if you could get it and you were willing to put up with the, many people thought lesser intellectual content and greater creative control, especially, famously by producers who would make silly demands about how your script had to be revised, which writers always bristled at, and continue, of course, to bristle at. So I think, and of course, now we see projects going from the screen to the stage, and so the movement goes to some extent the other way, but it's at much more of a corporate control level, as I understand it.
Going back to history and to this short time when there was the idea of the so-called American Authors Authority. I assume you are aware of this project that was initialized by James M. Cain, and the idea was to put all the authors, stage, screen, print together and make an agency for their copyrights. So that the usual idea is that the screenwriters get more control and have more power in negotiating with the producers, because they cannot just go on strike and stop their work, but they can also, if they are connected somehow, they can stop the sources, the source material also. And is this idea of an agency for copyrights that is established in many European countries and all over the world, is it completely gone with then in the 30s what is not realized, and somehow also told that as it's a communist idea and so on? Or are there some writers on stage for stage or screen that came up with, okay, it would be better if we have copyright for all of us?
It's a great question. You're correct. In the late 1930s through the 1940s, there was a group of writers, and of course, I know a little bit more about the outsized influence of some Hollywood writers who believed very strongly that writers should own their scripts. Um, they were some of the most successful writers in Hollywood because, of course, because they were successful, they saw the economic value of their scripts. Some of them, quite famously, were also very sympathetic to the communist project. And they were the group that was targeted by the anti-communist attack in 1947. And it is not a coincidence. The history shows, and this is true of all American labor history, that business decided as World War II was winding down in 1945, that their number one target needed to be, as one of them said, communism abroad and labor at home. And the success of their campaign was to identify labor and labor power as being communist dominated. And in Hollywood, which of course has always had more than its share of attention, it was very convenient for them that some of the most successful writers, and the marquee names that listeners to this podcast know even better than I do, happen to be quite sympathetic to the labor project of communism, as well as, importantly, the anti-racism civil rights project, for which the Communist Party had been the most reliable advocate of civil rights. And so it was easy to brand them as being communists, particularly because they were advocates for worker ownership of the means of production, such as writer ownership of their scripts. And so the attack on any form of writer ownership of the script wound up getting caught up in the blacklisting of the great writers. And of course, they then got subpoenaed by the anti-communists in the Congress, and they showed up and asserted that they had a First Amendment right to refuse to answer two questions. Number one, were they a member of the Writers Guild? And number two, were they associated with the Communist Party? Did they believe in communism? They refused to answer those questions. They were held in contempt of Congress. They were sentenced to prison. And of course, Bertolt Brecht was one of them, and he was subject to deportation. And instead, he just left the United States and returned to Germany. And the project of fighting for writer ownership of scripts through any framework, whether the writers would own it as individuals and license their scripts to the studios, or through something like the American Authors Authority, which was the more politically moderate version, and also presumably the one that would appeal to somewhat less successful writers. It all disappeared. It was a coordinated campaign in 1947. It was what prompted the attack on the Dramatists Guild at the same time to say that collective negotiation by dramatists, that they weren't employees protected by labor law. Instead, they were independent contractors, and collective negotiation would violate antitrust law. These were not just coincidences, it was concerted, and writers have never since been able to exert the power collectively to try to revive something like that. And I think it would take something much more earth-shaking and devastating to the whole industry, stage and screen, before a kind of a radical rethinking would emerge again. Because I think both parties, at least when you're talking about screen entertainment, are afraid of blowing things up. And I will say, though, one of the exciting things that we haven't really talked about, but I think may come about, is unionization of people who create video games. Right? 10 years ago or 15 years ago, people were thinking about, will there be a merger of video games and television, especially, where there will be, all TV shows will be interactive, where the player/viewer gets to choose their own kind of story and path, and that writing would be dramatically changed as audience expectations for kind of choose your own adventure would come to change television. That hasn't happened in the way that people think might have happened, but we have seen the quality of video games, especially the narrative quality, dramatically increase, and the storytelling change, and unionization among video game creators and writers for the screen, writing for video games as well. And so it may be that we will see a fairly significant change at some point in our lifetimes that then would be the moment where creators of content, as production companies like to call it, not my favorite word, where there's enough revolutionary change that then there will be a moment where creators, that is the people who create the stuff, are willing to rethink a framework if they're not worried about entrants from other places. But I also wonder whether it might also be a greater global framework, because so much creation is global.
I was just interested just by what you were saying in relation to AI, and obviously the way that, as in many industries, it kind of targets those entry levels where actually people get training, and there seems to be a certain short-termism in terms of people not really thinking about, how they get senior writers if they don't have junior writers, or senior engineers if they don't have junior engineers, and so on. But it just made me wonder, is there, because in the UK, the television companies sort of historically used to provide a lot of training in different ways, like putting people onto those kind of long-running shows, but also other kind of more formal training and just different schemes to kind of bring new people in, and they tend to have fallen away in the public broadcasting sector. And I was just wondering whether does the Writers Guild, is there anything around training that's sort of part of the agreements that they make? Is that part of what they look at?
The Writers Guild does do trainings of all kinds, both for new writers who are just entering the industry, on all kinds of things about writing, about how to sell a script, about technical stuff. They also have played a fairly significant role in training experienced writers to become showrunners. A showrunner in the US is a writer who becomes the person who works with all the writers in the writer's room, who ultimately is the writer responsible for the series, the season, and they are Writers Guild members. They are experienced writers. They are crucial for the production companies because you need somebody to manage the writing process. And because of their importance, both as creatives, they write scripts as well, but they also are responsible for making sure that the scripts get written on time and on budget. They have what might be in other industries described as supervisory responsibilities, but they are not supervisors under the law, but they perform an absolutely essential function for production companies, although they are not producers they're not supervisors and employees of the production company in the same sense in which supervisors in an industrial job are. And the Writers Guild has run showrunner trainings at the behest of both their own more junior writers, as well as writers who want to be showrunners, as well as the production companies. It works for everybody. And so the Writers Guild has played this kind of crucial training role for obvious reasons, because there isn't like one entity. It's not like there is the BBC in the UK that is the producing entity. There are all these different companies and workers. You write for a show on Hulu, and then you write for a show on NBC, and then you write, so they go back and forth among many, many different production companies. And of course, each movie is made by its own special purpose company. And so it's a much more fluid and fragmented labor market in a lot of ways. You have to have some entity like the Guild to do that. And I will say, apropos of the question about AI, one of the things that the Authors Guild is doing, the Authors Guild represents or speaks on behalf of and is a membership organization for independent published writers, nonfiction, novelists, whatever, to look out for their interests. And they now are urging writers to join the Guild and to certify that their work was written by a human being, not by AI. And this sort of certification role, which lots of unions have done over the years, the union label on clothes, or of course, there are union labels on film and television about it being done under the jurisdiction of the WGA or IATSE or whatever, tells viewers about the quality and the working conditions of the production. And we may also see, because of course AI is a threat not just to writers, but to actors in a big way. And so how can guilds use their power to protect junior writers, both their working opportunities, but also protect them against signing agreements where they sign away? This is especially an issue for actors or performers of any kind, their their rights to their voice, their likeness, their mannerisms, their gait, because actors are being asked to sign those agreements that then allow the production company to substitute a deepfake essentially for the actor, which could be a huge threat to actors starting out, as well as to any actor or perhaps a deceased actor who doesn't have the market power to prevent their likeness from being endlessly repurposed, including in ways that they might find aesthetically or creatively destructive, as well as destroying their livelihood.
Yeah, this reminds me that, for instance, last year I was lucky enough to be able to invite Jeff Mulvoine to give a masterclass to my students, and as you know, Jeff Mulvoine, I think he founded and ran a showrunner training program at the Writers Guild. But he was here because he also worked at the season of a BBC series, Killing Eve. And so one of my students asked him what he thought, comparing the two systems, in the UK and in America, what he thought was the most important element from a screenwriter's point of view when working at these projects. And his answer was, in America, we have a stronger union. And so I'm conscious of the time because we had just stopped the hour. So maybe one last question, if I can. Not just from an American perspective, but the world seems to have taken a sudden acceleration, if I can put it that way, in all sorts of directions since the American elections last November. So might unions, and in our case, the writers' unions, be facing a perfect storm, an existential threat of sorts in the near future? You talked about, earth-shaking events earlier. So what is your take on this?
I think unions do face an existential threat with the rise of right-wing populism, both in the United States and in the private sector. So one of the things that the new American administration is doing is destroying collective bargaining rights for all federal employees. You may have heard about the massive firings of civil servants. That is just the first step in trying to eliminate civil service protections, which in the US also encompass the right to join a union and bargain collectively. And although they ran as populists and as being interested in protecting the working class, like all authoritarian populist movements, I don't think it stays that way. There isn't one in history that has remained interested in allowing collective action by majoritarian groups that might threaten the authoritarian leadership. And historically in the US, the issue that divided the Republican Party from the Democratic Party has been labor issues. That's been true for 100 years. Well, it's been true for 250 years, to be honest. And so powerful unions that have influence with the public, as we saw in the period of attacks on so-called communists, which wound up being attacks on anybody with left-wing politics, regardless of their views on the Communist Party or the Soviet Union, were really about attacking labor, not just about attacking people's views on the foreign policy of the United States vis-a-vis the Soviet Union or the former Eastern Bloc. And I think that will be true in the US. It may be focused just at the moment on government employees, but it is not going to stay there. And so I think the bulwark of democracy in the United States, as has been true in Europe, in Asia, in South America, in Australia, and other places, has always been independent unions. I think the Writers Guild is acutely aware of that, and we can all draw our lessons from history.
Yeah, before I bring this to a close, Rosamund, maybe we can announce the guests for the next episode, for episode 4.
Yes, thank you so much, Catherine, for that really interesting talk and sobering final words. The next episode in April will be on Wednesday, the 9th of April, and we will be inviting Zipo Hlobo and Leila Skosana. They will be talking about screenwriting in South Africa, and specifically, so that the title of their chapter is The Evolving Depictions of Black South Africans in the Post-Apartheid Screenwriting Tradition, which will be an absolutely fascinating conversation, I'm sure. And that will be at 5 o'clock UK time. We will correctly provide the equivalents across the other continents when we send out the notification. But yeah, that's the next episode, which I think will be another exciting, really fascinating episode.
I jump in and thank Rosamund, Klaus, and Paolo for assembling such a superb book. Leaving aside chapter 28, I learned an enormous amount from reading these chapters. It's a huge contribution for any of us who think about writing, and you put in an incredible amount of effort under difficult circumstances. I'm so grateful to have been included, and recommend the book and the chapters to absolutely anybody with an interest.
Thank you very much, and we're very grateful for that you have contributed to the handbook as well. So please, can I ask everybody to join me in thanking Catherine? Thank you very much for being with us today. And to all of the colleagues who have joined us live and everyone who will be watching online, in solidarity, goodbye and take care.